Let's welcome him in from The Ringer. He is Ryen Russillo. He's not only a former talented radio host. You hear him podcast on The Ringer, and of course, he's a screenwriter extraordinaire as well. Just Washington football team, formerly Redskins. I'm sure you've read what the Washington Post had out there. What's your reaction?
It's still really disappointing. I think there's so many things that have gotten better in sports for women, opportunities that, I would say even 5, definitely 10 years ago, I would have been like, well, that's probably not going to happen. When I look at the way the NBA has not only changed its staffing, but the programming, it's incredible. These are close friends of ours, and we talk about it all the time off the air. But the other part of it that we all know about is that some of these guys are just out of control, and they still don't know how to act. And, you read that stuff and you just go, like that one personnel guy, you're like, what the hell is wrong with you, man? Like, are you serious? Like, every single girl that covers the team, every girl that shows up, and you're just going to harass them all? So, that was the part of it where I hate to keep saying this, but, working in sports as long as we have, I don't think either of us were all that surprised by some of that stuff. The smaller part of the story, which is not as important, but some of these people with their sources all week long, the lead up to this and what they were saying it could possibly be, I don't know that I would ever believe any of these people ever again on any report, because there was a lot of people out there that were connecting themselves to this story kind of for their own clout that were completely wrong about all the different directions that this story was going to go.
Yeah, when a takedown piece is going to come out, people like Ryen Russillo, our guest, people like us in the media, we hear about it, right? Like, man, I heard this takedown piece. Right. I heard this takedown piece coming, and like unless you've spoken to the reporters, unless you've actually seen it, like you're just so much better to sit it out, because it actually ends up diminishing the piece. Like, oh, that's it. That's it. Like, it's not that's it. Like, there's some serious stuff in there. By the way, there's this other part to it where some men, and I don't know if all these guys are married or not, so I don't know, but like one guy said something in a bar, and like some guys just don't know how to actually talk to women. That's actually, there's an element to it where like, hey, you're a creep. Hey, there's one guy who's looking up a woman's dress and equipment manager while she's on some stairwell. Like, who does that? But the don't even know how to have like a legit. Does that line actually work? In what world does you have a backside like a wagon work? How does that work? Who thinks that's going to work to get a lady?
I don't know. I just, the conversations that I had with women that I would consider some of my closest friends, and some of the stuff that they've told me that people have said to them, I just shake my head. I go, why would you even want, like, you don't even know the person. You don't even know if they're interested in you. And maybe, the person is married. I think sometimes with guys, especially in this industry, it's just something that I've always noticed, and it's a theory, but it's, you're a younger guy, and, you work, you get married young, and then, you start to actually have a little success, so now you're kind of important in the industry, and then you're around, especially if we're talking about on-air women, generally very attractive women, and they lose their minds. Like, all of a sudden they have some power, and it's this thing they've never experienced before. They were never cool. They never, like, they're always socially awkward or whatever. And then now all of a sudden they have this power, and they think they can kind of get away with things. And I've never understood it. It drives me crazy. It actually makes me furious at times, especially when it's people that I'm close friends with.
Yeah. Ryen Russillo, our guest here in the herd. I'm Doug Gottlieb, filling in for Colin. I look at it, and I do have this thing where I'm like, how have the Cowboys had not been better? Right? Like, Dak obviously has done really well against the Redskins and really well against the Giants, but you consider that in his 4 years, the Redskins have been a mess. Their best record is 8-7-1. The Giants, first year Dak was a starter, they won 11 games. After that, they've been an abject disaster. I almost look at this and I see all the dysfunction within the Redskins, knowing that the Giants have been through a complete rebuild. And then the last 2 years, let's be honest, the Eagles have really suffered the Super Bowl hangover. I do think there's a little bit of an indictment of Dak, which leads me to kind of understand why the Cowboys could have gotten the deal done and chose to play a one-year deal instead.
Well, first of all, I think it's really hard to win playoff games, okay? If you go through this exercise, and I used to do it all the time, and you'll look at like some of the teams that we think are better franchises in the NFL, and you'll go, oh, wait a minute, that team's gone like 9 years without winning a playoff game. And we lose track of it because we're not living it every single week with all 32 franchises. But there's fan bases everywhere that can't believe their own team. Like, hey, when's the last time? I mean, think how long Dallas actually went. I mean, Minnesota had this absurd gap in there. And you're like, wait, Minnesota hasn't won a playoff game in forever? So I do think sometimes it's harder to win playoff games than maybe we expect. We spend so much time talking about Dallas, which is so incredibly boring because so many times, like, I get the attraction of Dallas, I get playing the hits. But between the Zeke and Dak updates, I mean, the Dak thing never really changed for like 7 months. I had heard last fall from an NFL guy, hey, it's like 4 years, it's like 140, and it's over 100 million guaranteed. So I was like, wow, that's pretty good on the guarantee number in comps to other people, but he must be really wanting to break the bank. So that's what I always kind of thought was happening. And then at the very end, the report comes out that, maybe Dak was willing to kind of concede and do this, which I think at least on a shorter deal, not the Mahomes deal, but on a shorter deal with how the cap may be recalculated with everything that's going on right now, that shorter deal with that kind of guarantee may be worth it, knowing that if everything works out, he's probably going to do another big deal in 3 or 4 years. I'm just not going to do like an anti-Dak thing because there's enough quarterbacks that just kind of came up next where Jared Goff was just the next guy up, and the Rams thought he was great in his press conference, so they gave him like 100+ guaranteed, which didn't make any sense. And if Dak wanted to break the bank and go for more than that, that's fine. And something you said, too, if you play the franchise tag right. Now, look, I think the franchise tag is terrible because it exists. It's a device to suppress salaries. But if you play it right in back-to-back years, you can clean up in 2 years and just straight cash and then clean up when you do your new deal with all sorts of new guarantees. So this really isn't that – I don't think it's insulting really by either side trying to execute this thing, but we've turned it into this massive standoff where I kind of understand both parties, and I don't think it's really even a knock on Dak by what Dallas is trying to execute here.
I don't think the franchise tag is a salary suppressor. I think it's why do you believe that? Because
it exists. It's not when people say like, oh, the franchise tag isn't that big of a deal. It's only been used this many times. You're like, that's not the point. The point is that it exists, and it's always a tool that can be used against you when you are the premier guy hitting free agency. So you never actually get to real free agency. If quarterback...
Correct, but that's not... But again, you're saying it exists to suppress salaries. I would disagree with you. I would say it exists... It exists so that teams can hold on to their players. It's what the NBA desperately wishes they had, so they didn't have all this movement. It's one of the reasons that the NFL believes they're more successful is that they don't have this. And we saw a lot of the shuffling of the deck this past offseason, far more so than we ever have. But a lot of that is because you got quarterbacks kind of at the very, very end where they put themselves in position to be complete free agents. But that's why it exists.
That's not what I'm saying. No. This is why it suppresses salaries. Because if you don't have it, okay, if you're a quarterback who goes, hey, I want a new deal, my contract's up. Okay, well then I guess if we're not interested in meeting your demands, you'll go to market. And then we'll see what happens. If these top quarterbacks actually got to a true free agency, they'd be getting way beyond $100 million guaranteed. They would. Like, think of teams who haven't had a good quarterback for a decade. And like, hey, do you want to just get this guy? Okay, what? All right, isn't $150 million guaranteed? Who cares? Perception has kept, I think, the guarantees down because we've all just assumed, like, oh, you can't do that with any of these guys. So the fact that you can just say, oh, well, who cares? We'll just tag them. Then you never get to, like, the free market that exists.
I don't think it's a free market, but I think it's been collectively bargained, and I do think there's a penalty for teams where it does dollar for dollar go against the cap, and that's kind of what you have to balance out.
That goes up like $10 million every year,
but it's not going.
It's gone up,
but you
can't argue COVID in 2020 the cap not going up. It's gone up over $80 million in a decade.
Yes, but if you're carrying that big of a cap number, it's going to hurt a team's ability to fill out a roster around it in the short term, right? That's the benefit. All these GMs, they want long-term stability. They're willing to overpay to get a little bit to get, so long term. I know what my quarterback is. You got to be reasonable about it, and the long-term deals don't always pan out to be the good ones, especially in other sports. Like we talk about these other sports, like these long-term deals are good ones. Point out how many have actually been good ones for teams, and I think the NFL also. Like, look, this is the only sport like this. You really are one Alex Smith hit away from being debilitated. I want to get to the NBA kind of quickly here. Ryen Russillo, our guest.
I still think the Alex Smith thing is a total exception, though. That doesn't happen like ever. It happened to a quarterback, and it sucks that it happened to him, but it's not happening to like a handful of quarterbacks every year.
Okay, okay. I mean, I that's fair. That's absolutely fair. I also think that the long-term deals, like the Pat Mahomes, those are the exception, right? Like Brady's been the best. He's done these short-term deals time and again, and it's one of those things that quarterbacks can do because generally the Alex Smith thing doesn't happen to them. It's at both ends of the spectrum. The quarterbacks get screwed in terms of the top end, and then the running backs are left because how much leverage do you really have when you can be replaced by two or three guys at pennies on the dollar in comparison, whereas quarterbacks can't really be replaced. So it's one of those things where they collectively bargain, but it doesn't totally work for the sport because there's such a discrepancy in length of career, style of play, realistic, percentage of chance of injury. Is that fair?
I just don't think the long-term deals in the NFL are fake deals anyway. It's the money in the first 3 years, and then they can rework these things as they want to. They get the cap flexibility to have the bumps go up every single time. I've read all the stuff on percentage of the salary cap for quarterbacks. I think it's an interesting trend, but I don't think it's a law.
Ryen Russillo joining us in the herd. What's appropriate attire for answering the door when you get room service?
Well, you got to put some clothes on, man. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what. Like, I think sometimes we forget how young pro athletes are, especially as we get older. But the fact that guys need to be reminded of this stuff, I don't. Part of me isn't surprised, but I kind of wish I were.
Is it? Do they have to come out of pocket, or is it an all-inclusive resort? Like, I can't really tell.
Well, the Disney deal, usually you just have that band that you put on, which is genius because, it's a lot like when you go to a casino, you wouldn't bet as much if you had to put cash on the table every single time. Same thing with the credit card. Everybody's got us hooked on plastic, and the mechanism of doing it, you just feel like you're not really spending real money. So it's good for the economy because we all end up spending a little bit more. The Disney band, you're never even taking anything out. It's like waving a little digital watch and stuff. So I thought everybody had the Disney band, which has a bunch of different things going on with it. And, I've had it before when I went down there. I did a couple of different events when I was still with ESPN. But trust me, if those guys are paying for cash, somebody's going to complain about it on an IG video. So, let's not. The content will be there. If you need a question answered about a potential complaint or somebody's salad bar, well, actually, salad bars are outlawed now anyway, but I'm sure someone will let us know.
Okay, how much does it affect the Lakers to not have Rondo and Avery Bradley?
Bradley's a bigger deal than Rondo is. Rondo wasn't very good in a lot of combinations on the floor. Like, there were certain Rondo numbers where I went, oh, wow, that's even worse, which is kind of funny because when I watched Rondo, I actually thought physically and whether or not, Rondo's had so many moments in his career where you're like, okay, you're checked out, huh? Like, you don't care, which I always think is funny about Rondo. Like, he's admitted he hasn't played defense for a long time. He has zero interest in playing defense. He's been a malcontent at times, and then he would just turn it on at certain spots and then would call out everybody else for criticizing him. I'm like, dude, you're essentially mailing it in during these games, and it's painfully obvious, and you even admitted to it at times. So why is it our fault for ever pointing it out? So even though I thought physically there were things I liked about him this year, it just wasn't really a big part of any of the things that they were doing success-wise. Bradley is just another body that you can trust, although he's not really a point. he's somebody who defensively is terrific. He can have those kind of outburst scoring games. I mean, if he had 20, it's great, but if he had 2, you wouldn't be shocked either. But I just felt like the James Davis combination was so good, and both Biggs and McGee and Howard ended up benefiting so much from LeBron in a way that I didn't even really think would happen. And I was like, my gosh, like everything is so easy for these guys. So yeah, the rotation on paper isn't what the Clippers rotation is. We all know that going into it, but it felt like this stoppage messed up the Lakers probably more than anybody, because the way they were playing and getting things rolling, I just started to buy into the whole thing a lot more. I was like, I just think I trust those 2 guys more than I trust anybody else. So, the Bradley thing's a knock just because it's the rotation thing, and I don't know how those replacements are going to help out. But the rotation's short enough anyway, and if LeBron and AD are terrific, they're at least going to be in the Western Conference Finals anyway.
I'll give you the one guy that I almost forgot existed in this discussion, and they weren't getting nearly as much as they thought they would get out of him, and I think he's going to be the deciding factor. It's Kuzma, right? Because look, Bradley was playing his best basketball as a Laker when they started playing great. I don't like losing Rondo in terms of the numbers of ball handlers, but Rondo, I don't know. I feel like you have a head coach that looks at Rondo and sees 2010 Rondo and it's 2020, and that's always dangerous, right? Where Rondo he's a guy who should barely be on the roster, and yet, because of what he did 10 years ago, the coach might put him in the last 5 minutes of a game. But
no doubt.
But our entire calculus about who the Lakers are is taking into account that Kyle Kuzma was having a disappointing year. Now he's had essentially the entire offseason to get it right. I think he could be the guy who could change the entire calculus of this team.
He could. I mean, he's certainly talented enough, but I mean, this is something you've always said, which is a great line. It's like even the worst team has a leading scorer. And Kuzma is a different guy with a different roster and now with less opportunity, and it hasn't always been smooth, which is to be understood. Like, it's not even like a criticism to like, hey, how come you're not as good right now? Like, Kevin Love's numbers went way down once he was on the Cavs, because it's like, hey, you don't get to be the guy taking a million shots and grabbing every single rebound like you were with Minnesota. So I think the talent is there, but it hadn't ever really been the basketball fit. And maybe the scary thing for the rest of everybody else is that really when LeBron and AD are going, it's almost like it doesn't matter who else is out there anyway. It really, that's how in love I am with that combination. So it's definitely, like, I'm not disagreeing with you at any point. I don't know if the break resets him and we see him engaged in a way where it's just more consistent and he understands his role a little bit, or if it was just a break and because of personnel, we see the same Kuzma again, but it just, is in an arena in Orlando.
There's no home court advantage, but there's also there's no road disadvantage, right? So it does feel like they're going to be exhibition games more so than real games, with the exception of the teams trying to get into the playoffs, I guess. Is there who are we missing, right? Is it the Celtics? Is that the team? Is it the Sixers with Sarton Shake Milton at the point? Like, who's the team? There's 3 teams but there's got to be another team, isn't there?
Okay, but I feel like everybody's done this because it's different. And by the way, I don't know if people are really ready for this. And I'm not going to do it. And whatever. I mean, social media. But the complaining those first few days and what the product looks like and how weird it's going to feel. I don't know if people are ready for this, because it's going to be weird. Like, I've gone down there. I'm sure you probably have too. Like, back when they used to have the draft camp there, where, they had it in Chicago forever, and then they put it down in Orlando because they had all these great facilities. So when all this stuff first went down, I was like, Orlando actually is probably the solution. And I had been there for like 6 years, and you just sat way up into the stands, and you could walk around back then. It's not going to happen now. And you'd just be watching all these games going at once. I mean, so it's not going to be the same execution, but the backdrops and all this stuff, like it's going to feel like AAU stuff with huge guys that are older and fancier uniforms. And, this is about sacrifice, like Silver said. So, I don't think anybody really should be complaining about it, but everybody's going to. As far as what we're supposed to do and how we factor that in, I feel like people have gotten really motivated to try to pick out different outcomes now because of this. But I don't understand, like, why would the team that's the 4 or 5 seed now all of a sudden have some advantage just because of no home court? Maybe, but home court value has even been diminished a little bit more in the playoffs than you probably realize, because it used to be like overwhelming back in the day. But if it's the Celtics because they're younger I looked at how the playoff spacing breaks down, and there's a little less, but there's still plenty of playoff games in the more recent, real version of this where it was only a day off. And the Celtics, even though I really like that team and Tatum going for 30 a game for like 2 months there, they never played together all year. They did, but they didn't. I mean, their top 5 guys in minutes all missed a good chunk, except for maybe Jalen. And now Jalen this time too. So,
right.
Like, I'm supposed to pick the team that hasn't been together, and then Philly, who was amazing at home, and now in Orlando system, I'm supposed to buy into them when they were just atrocious on the road. And Houston, who, it's almost like we're doing the NHL thing with them, where it's like, hey, could this team win it? They're like, man, if the goalie gets hot, like, all right, well, let me just do that with every playoff team, because you can just do that constantly in the NHL playoffs. So when you go like Rockets, you never know with that shooting if they could get hot. Yeah, I also know this, is that 7-game series with that smaller lineup, that's a different test than kind of catching teams off guard right when they had made that trade. And sure, right, if Harden and Westbrook go nuts, which they were, and Harden gets his shooting back, which I'm sure he's going to, he had a kind of a lull there at the end of the regular season, but it's still a 6-seed team as of right now. So I'm supposed to pick the 6-seed team to come out of the West over either of those LA teams? Like, that doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So I think with the time off, and I get it, there's been a bit of a push to try to figure out, like, different outcomes, but I don't know why. Like, hey, we had like 60 games with these teams. Why would you start picking teams that came in 4th and 5th?
I don't know. I guess everything regresses to the mean, but we got to give us a reason to watch these other games. Ryan, great stuff. Can't wait to hear the next pod dropping on the Ringer. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Doug.